It's great to have Owen Cottom, back with me today. And can I just encourage you, if this is the first time you've come across Owen, that you go and have a look at a previous video where I have a conversation with Owen about planting Grace Church in Grangetown, and that was in 2018. So welcome, Owen. And before we have a conversation, just very, very briefly, just tell us about yourself. Just, where, for those who don't know, where Grangetown is and who you're married to, etc. So would you do that?
Absolutely. Great to be back with you, Gwyneth. I'm Owen. I'm married to Charlotte. We have 4 little boys, and we are based here in the south of Cardiff, so south of Wales's capital city in Grangetown, which is Wales's most ethnically diverse postcode, so a place where the nations are gathered, and it is a wonderfully exciting and interesting place to be living out the gospel for that reason and others.
Brilliant. Thank you. So rather than being sent out to the nations, God is bringing the nations to you. Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Yeah. So what I'd like us to have a conversation about, or actually hear, more of what you've got to say, is I'm going to ask you a question. What would be the 3 things that you would do differently in planting a church next time? Or what 3 things have you learned that, okay, I can do that differently next time? Can you share that with us?
Absolutely. It's a real joy to do so, because a question like that enables some reflection, which often in the pioneering energy of church planting, the opportunity to reflect is those opportunities are few and far between. So I appreciate just the opportunity to pause and to think, wow, what would we do differently? The first one that comes to mind is very simply to play the long game, I can remember when we first planted in 2018, one of the most common emotional responses that I had to deal with personally as a church planter, as a pioneering leader, was the roller coaster ride of measuring things Sunday by Sunday. Okay. And I think probably for other church planters, you'll resonate as soon as you start a Sunday gathering, whether that's in a home or a community center or in your own building. And as soon as you make a kind of public declaration, we are here, we are here to make much of Jesus and to share Jesus with this community and to be a community of Jesus in this community. As soon as you do that, there's a subtle pressure that creeps in, and that pressure can come in different forms, but I think the one that I experienced it most in those early days was just that pressure to gather people into this thing that we were planting and express particularly in terms of Sunday attendance. And I've got to be honest, I look back at that first year of Grace, and there is so much to give thanks to God for. And retrospectively, some things that I look back on now and think, wow, I'm at the time I might have struggled with that, but I'm glad that God was nurturing and protecting this little plant as we were growing. But one of the most kind of strong memories of that time is having those Sundays where lots of people come, there's guests, newcomers, unbelievers who are joining us, and a sense of momentum and excitement, this thing that we're believing God to grow into a community of blessing. It's happening before our very eyes. And then other Sundays where you get to the end of the Sunday and you think, I'm not sure we're going to be here next week. People away, or some people that you thought were kind of joining and exploring faith, wander away, or other things happen. And so as I look back on all of that, I would very simply want to say to my past self, Owen, play the long game here. It's not about living Sunday to Sunday. If you have a Sunday where it feels like everything went wrong with the PA system and the sermon wasn't great and the worship wasn't as vibrant as you wanted it to be, and there weren't many people around, there was no newcomers, there were no unbelievers joining, I think I would just kind of pat my former self on the shoulder and say, God is building this thing in his time. Be patient. play the long game, live less Sunday by Sunday, care less about immediate outcomes. Don't try to do everything all at once as well. Don't try to be a fully established church on day one or even year one of the church plant journey. Just take your time, take a breath, play the long game, and be patient and watch what God does.
And I suppose, sort of looking back 5 years down the road now, as you look back, I'm sure that you can think, well, there was no need for me to be thinking that way from Sunday to Sunday, because looking back, God was in control all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah? And I think on that, the church planter's psalm that I've discovered is a psalm for my soul as a church planter. I think along those lines, Gwyneth, is Psalm 127, which says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders work in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stay awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise early and go late to bed at night, eating the bread of anxious toil. And I just love that line. I think that line sums up lots of the internal energy of church planters very often. And if we're really honest with ourselves, there can be this kind of feeding on anxious toil. I've got to make something happen here. I've got to gather people. I've got to put on a performance. And I just think all of that so cuts against the grain of what biblical faith is, which is, Lord, this is on you. And instead of wasting energy in anxious toil and being over diligent and maybe caring too much about external outcomes or other metrics of success, just take a breath. And what is interesting about Psalm 127 is what it then contrasts eating the bread of anxious toil with, which is, for the Lord gives his beloved sleep. And I think that is the posture of someone who's playing the long game. You look at Jesus in the storm. What's he doing while the disciples are panicking? He's taking a nap because he could see the end from the beginning. He was totally secure in the Father's plan. And I think that is essential for church planters. And I'll be honest, in that early season, there was a lot of faith. There was a lot of, Lord, we're believing you for something. There was a lot of pioneering, stepping out good things. But kind of mingled in with all that in the broth was a fair degree of, is this thing really going to happen? Sure. I'm sure. And that was expressed probably in just anxiously going into Sundays. Is it going to work out okay? Sometimes anxiously coming out of Sundays. I guess there's probably a kind of corollary lesson here as well in just putting too much weight on Sundays. Sundays are, or whatever the main gathering of the church is, they're a hugely important, vital aspect of what it means to be the gathered people of God. But if we measure everything by them, then we're missing so much of what it really means to be a disciple and a community of disciples. So.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So just in case anybody's disappointed when they go to Psalm 127, they won't see the title Church Planters Psalm, will they? Because you just labelled it. You've just just in case there's anybody listening and looking for it. It is.
Yeah. Yes.
This is Psalm 127. But we are very reactive people, really. And so once you've committed yourself, you've been praying, looking forward, excitement, and then you launched, and then you commit yourself. You committed then, and there's no going back. So you want to see the fruit. You want to see people gathering. You want to see success. But one of the things I've learned is how it's important, not just with churches now, but in anything that we do, is not so much to look at numbers, but to look at how much of a blessing are we to other people. And I think that's the measure, I think, that whether you're a church planter or whatever you do, because not everybody's a church planter. And so if somebody's got a small ministry making cups of tea, or if somebody's just relating to neighbours, and they're not a church leader, and so they haven't got that massive sort of numbers game to contend with, as long as an individual is a blessing to somebody else, that is a fruitful ministry. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So, lovely. So that was the first one. Okay.
I think the second reflection I would have on what I would do differently is to empower and delegate and involve people from our early core group more in the central activity of our church.
That's really a big one. Go on.
I'm
looking forward to hearing this one.
Well, I think if people were to come to Grace Church Cardiff today, I would hope that one of the senses they would get is that we really believe in the priesthood of all believers, the kind of ancient theological idea that every person who puts their faith and trust in Jesus is called into this kingdom of priests where we can all minister to God and we can all minister to each other, and we've all got something to give, something to contribute in the building up of the body of the church. I would hope that is something that bleeds from us now. But I think in the early days of Grace, that was there, that heart was there, absolutely. But I think at times it was slightly suppressed. This is just my own subjective reflection in some ways, but slightly suppressed by my nervousness of being so aware of the fragility of an early church plant and wanting to ensure that we were really growing in a sound and healthy way. And I think what I did at times to overcompensate in light of some of that nervousness and fear was to make my voice the loudest voice. And there was a degree to which that's appropriate. God had given us the vision, entrusted and stewarded this vision to us. He'd called me to be the leader of this new community of faith. And in other contexts, that might be a very, very appropriate way of starting, that the leader really does have to kind of put a stake in the ground and this is who we are, this is what we're about. In all contexts, I think that is what leaders are called to do, but in some particularly so. The reason why I reflect back and think, I'm not sure it was quite right for us is we just had a wonderful core group of people who got the vision, and a wonderful core group of people who were with us, and a wonderful core group of people who had different gifts to me as the leader. And I remember very vividly, there was one Sunday in the middle of July 2018, I think it was, or June, July 2018. And I'd been there every Sunday up to this point and preaching most of them, walking through John's gospel, really laying a gospel foundation. I woke up on that Sunday morning and just felt sick as a dog and realized I'm not going to make it to this service. And that panic sets in. Oh, what are we going to do? Who's going to preach? Who's going to host the service? And quickly we scrambled together a plan to have a testimony Sunday. And I remember Charlotte coming back from that Sunday gathering and just effusively like, that was one of the...
We don't need you anymore, Owen.
Exactly. It was exactly, that was how I heard it. And to be honest, I didn't hear it as you're done, you're redundant. I heard it as relief. It's not all on me. It's not all about my leadership and shaping of this thing. God is building this. God has invested wisdom and teaching gifts and testimonies and stories and words of encouragement, exhortation. He's invested that in the body. This is the body of Christ. My sheep hear my voice, Jesus said. Not just my shepherds, my sheep hear my voice. And I remember hearing what a wonderful Sunday that was, how people just so openly shared their hearts and what God was teaching them at the moment, and just thinking, why have I been so tight-fisted about, I've got to keep this vision really, really kind of closely held, tightly held in terms of me dictating and forming and shaping things. And so I reflect now into those early church planting days and think, I wish we had empowered, delegated, heard the voice more of others alongside the rightful, appropriate, hey guys, what God's called me to contribute to this is to sow the vision in and to keep us kind of walking in our values together. And
So you can look back. You can look back at July 2018 and see that as a sort of a tipping point, as a shift. Can you?
Yeah, I think certainly an internal shift. Yeah, definitely. And even up to that point, I think, like I said, that heart was there to be that kind of church. It wasn't like a day and night. But from that moment on, I think I realized what God wants this church to become is not just invested in me. It's invested in all the people who he is building into this community of faith. And we need to represent the flavor. I'm speaking as someone who's not a great cook, but, you make a great bolognese and it's not just the mince. The mince are really important, but it's got other ingredients in there. And what brings the richness is the ingredients coming together. I think very much that's how church and church planting works. And I say this particularly in church planting because I would want to say to other young church planters, don't undervalue your contribution as the one that God has stewarded the vision to, but also don't overvalue your contribution as the one God has stewarded the vision to, because he wants whatever the church is to become, he wants to bring that out, draw that out of the people that he is building together as the family of faith in that place. One of my favorite quotes I'll just share to kind of round this off. One of my favorite quotes, one of my heroes really in the wider Christian world is Eugene Peterson. And Eugene Peterson, writer of The Message, but most of his writing is on pastoral ministry. And he writes that you shouldn't let the spirituality of a church grow from without, but from within. What does he mean? What he means by that is it shouldn't be imposed on the church. This is what you should be, cookie cutter church. This is what you should be, but rather in the organic process of God, the Holy Spirit, knitting people together into this community, the flavor and spirituality of the church, obviously grounded on the gospel. So there's some things we share in common doctrinally and all that in the background, but the distinct flavor grows from the people God draws together in that place.
Lovely. And just on that sort of priesthood of believers, where every believer has a part to play in the church, and I appreciate that needs to be stewarded by the leadership team. But there's two sides to it. There's the from yourselves as leaders in delegating, really, and because one of the things that we've talked about in a previous conversation is about how you need to know your grace and need to know the grace that's on you, and so by recognizing the grace that's on you, you know what you're not called to do. So it's important to be able to shift that weight of responsibility onto people who are gifted. But it's also important for the people who are part of the church, who may not be in leadership, because if they're not being used, they become frustrated. They become frustrated because they're gifted and they see things, and if they're not being used, and if there's only 2 or 3 people doing everything, they'll soon get frustrated, and they will be discouraged, and they will be possibly looking at moving on. So it's a really, really important point that you've made, Owen, is to that, and by God's grace, he enabled you to recognize that very early on, really.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Even though I appreciate what you're saying, the heart was always there. It's just it wasn't working out in practice. So,
and I would add to that as well. Yeah, no, absolutely. And the grace of God over our whole story, I look back on and think, wow, but for the grace of God, what would we have become? But I think you're right to tie in that idea of what's the grace that's on you, because one of the interesting other reflections I have, this is like a 2B. This isn't my third reflection.
Okay. Oh,
but,
okay. A bonus.
Yeah. I often talk about church planting as a gospel experiment. It's carrying the seed of the gospel, and you're saying, right, let's plant it in the ground with faith, but we don't know what's going to happen. We just pray, Lord, open the heavens and water this seed. We'll try and keep the conditions healthy. And it's a gospel experiment. One of the parts of the experiment for me was like, I think I knew it at that point, like mostly what the graces, the gifts that God had given me were. But one of the kind of theories I was working with was like, how much of an evangelist is in me, really? Like how much of a kind of proclaiming the clear good news of Jesus and kind of reaping a harvest of souls, and seeing people respond to the gospel and equipping others to do that. And I've realized I am not an evangelist. And it's interesting because I think sometimes we assume church planters, and I think many should be very evangelistically gifted. We don't just want to, gather a crowd of other sheep from other flocks. We want to see the lost sheep won. But I think that this thing plays into, as it began to dawn on me, God has given me other gifts, but that's not one of them. I realized if I don't delegate and raise up and create an environment where it's not all cookie cutters of Owen once again, because it's my voice and my gifts and my culture that's kind of the main thing that's shaping it. I need to create an environment where evangelists feel really at home and really empowered, because if I don't, then we'll miss out on having that gift in the church, and we will really, really suffer for it in terms of our missional impact in the wider community. And so that's another dimension of this delegate more, empower more. I think it really does tie into a recognition of your gifts as a leader and the limits of those things. Yeah.
And, we could carry on talking about this, even, how the church is the body with different parts, but we're not going to. I'm going to sort of resist that temptation. Okay. So third thing, Owen, share with us what you would do differently next time around, given the opportunity, which I'm sure you will be given the opportunity, because you've already sort of stepped out into Grace Canton, and that won't be the last one. I'm confident of that. So continually learning. So third thing, what would you do differently?
So the final thing that I would do differently is I would build firmer boundaries around family time, I think, is the final thing.
Wow.
There is something about church planting which is rightly all-encompassing. There's that sense of gospel urgency we've spoken about. There's that sense of call of God that you're living with. All good and healthy things. But if we're not careful in making that all-encompassing, we can have our family swallowed up in that in an unhelpful and unhealthy way. Now, one of the things I'm a big advocate of is take your family on the adventure. There is nothing like an adventure of church planting for young children to see God answer prayers and gather people together. Our eldest, who's 7 now, was 9 months when we started Grace, and you can show him pictures of there in the community centre. There's 10 people sat around in a circle. It's beautiful to think he's walked that journey with us. So absolutely, we need to take our family on the adventure, but we have to be careful we don't sweep our family up into the chaos of church planting that can come. And I think, looking back, particularly in that first year, one of the reflections I have is that I wanted to be omni-available, like all available, totally available to the people who we were gathering together, people who were looking into joining our church family, people who were exploring faith. I wanted to be that kind of laid down leader who says, you can rely on me. I'm here. Any need you have, pick up the phone. But I look back now, and once again, it's the grace of God that it didn't cause any kind of family damage. But at times, I just think there was a stress and a strain that we were already bearing just in the spiritual weight of pioneering with the gospel that didn't need to be placed upon the family. And my stress mostly, me being in the environment of the home where I should be and I long to be a peaceful and a joyful presence for my wife and for my boys. I just want to be that representation of God the Father, present and generous and calm. But I've learned for myself, unless I put boundaries in place, particularly as it relates to my phone and checking, that little machine of getting the messages in about who's leading the small group Bible study tonight and who's doing the outreach for this. And I've got this problem that's come my way. Can we meet and have a coffee? And, all stuff which is a vital part of being a leader in a church, being available to the flock in that way. But I realized I can't at one and the same time be tethered to this doorway of potential chaos and be a joyful, life-giving father and husband in the home. I need to create some healthy boundary that enables me to be responsible and fully invested in a godly way in caring for the flock that God is growing. But I also need to be present. And
I'll ask you in a minute, and I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it. I'll ask you as to how well you're able to balance that at the moment now, okay? So where you're up to with that. But let me just share a couple of things in that. Well, let me encourage you to start with, in that, the kids are still young. There are some church leaders, pastors, who this happens to, where not that they ignore the family, but the family are just sort of tagging along on their tailcoat sort of thing. And they get to, an age where the kids leave home and they realize, hang on, I've given everything to this pastoral ministry and neglected my kids. So I want to encourage you that your kids are very young. So the grace of God has shown you already, I need to address this. Okay. But let me just share this story. And this is a leader in Wales. I'm not going to name the leader, but this is a true story of a leader in Wales who was all consumed with pastoral ministry. And he was at his desk one day and he was sort of typing away. And one of his boys came in and tried to get his attention. Dad. And he didn't hear him because he was away. And he himself has shared this story, okay? And he was typing away. And then his son said, Pastor. And that got his attention. And he realized then, okay, there's something wrong here. And he addressed it. It's a real danger. And the earlier that you've already recognized it by the grace of God, the earlier that church leaders recognize that, particularly church leaders like yourself, who are all consuming into, you've got a heart for the gospel, you're all in, both feet, everything else, but just to be aware of family as well. Yeah. So, Owen, just to close this sort of conversation, what sort of things you've said about your phone, where are you up to on that journey of being able to get that balance right? Do you think that you've still got more work to do?
Absolutely. Yes.
So how are you sort of, just to give practical tips to others who are, consumed in this and thinking, that's a good point, I need to do something. Just give some practical tips.
And I would say I'm going to absolutely just give a couple of practical pointers that have really helped me. Before I say that, I think I'm really mindful of different contexts. And one of the game changers for us has been appointing an eldership and a leadership team where there's a shared load, and I think that is just, once again, a biblical necessity as the church plant develops. And that has enabled me to once again mentally make that shift of like, it isn't all on me. It was never all on me. It's unless the Lord builds the house, but it's enabled me to make that shift and also enabled me to take some practical steps. So for instance, one big thing for me is just a Sabbath, having a day of the week where you switch off and you're not Owen the pastor, you're not Owen the leader, Owen the Bible teacher, Owen the whatever other responsibilities. You're just Owen the human being. And one of the ways that you express that is switching off technology as best as you can, being unreachable. And there's an act of trust in that, of like, God, I give the flock to you, and any requests and demands that come in that do represent needy people that need help, I am going to take a leap of faith and say, I don't need to be present for them. And that's hard for someone who's got a pastoral heart. I want to be there.
Yeah. So
the Sabbath, I think, is just ring fencing one day a week at least where you can switch off. And the other thing in terms of which definitely I'm better and worse at this day by day is just get to the end of a day, and whatever time you choose, you switch the phone off or you leave the device somewhere else and you're present in the home. And particularly we are really big on our evening meals as a family, being all present and sat around the table. And so that's a no-go zone for me with my phone. And Charlotte has permission to call me out if I'm sneaking a little. There's this thing happening tonight. I've just got to. And she's wonderfully gracious, but helpfully firm in that as well. But you're right. It's an ongoing battle, and it's when we think we're doing well on that, and we think I can just squeeze. I'm doing fine. I
deserve a reward for doing so well. Yeah.
Exactly. That's when we're at kind of greatest danger in losing some of the ground we may have gained. So,
yeah. And these are little things, really. They do involve sacrifice, but they're little things, but they're so important, because when you add these little things together on a regular day-to-day basis or a weekly basis with a Sabbath, they add up to a lot and make a lot of difference. So so thank you, Owen.
Thank you.
Thank you once again for sharing from your experience, because I've said this before, you're not an expert yet. Sorry. You're not an expert, and you would be the first one to acknowledge you're not an expert. But
absolutely.
But you have got a voice in this, because you've walked the walk. You're continuing to walk the walk. You've got a great deal of wisdom, and I do appreciate the fact that you're willing to share sort of warts and all, challenges and the difficulties and things you would do differently. So I just want to thank you for that. Okay, and we'll line up another one. Okay, we'll line up another one so we can talk about and really just to encourage people. Especially church planters, but I'm hoping that what you've shared about family time, that applies to every leader across the board, whether you're planting a church or not. So I'm hoping that a lot of people are gleaning from this, not just church planters. But for now, thank you, Owen, and
thank you.
We'll catch up soon. Okay, bless you. See you, mate.
See you soon.
Ta-ra.